A quiet, scarred man bought a girl marked broken by the world, only to learn her spirit was merely waiting for a hand gentle enough to let it mend. The dust of Redemption Gulch clung to Elara like a shroud, a gritty testament to her daily despair. It wasn't just the endless, choking clouds kicked up by the freight wagons and the callous hooves of uncaring horses, it was the dust of hopelessness, settling deep in her lungs, in the marrow of her bones. She stood before the raw timber front of the general store, a ledger in the mud-caked hand of Silas Blackwood, her current master, her name a damning entry in his bitter accounting. Elara, he spat, the name a curse on his tongue, still too sick to earn her keep, still a drain on honest men. His voice, amplified by cheap whiskey and inherent cruelty, carried across the dusty thoroughfare, drawing smirks from lounging layabouts and furtive, pitying glances from women who hurried past, clutching their own meager provisions a little tighter. Elara coughed then, a dry, rattling sound that shook her thin frame, a sound Silas seemed to take as a personal affront. His hand, thick and calloused, shot out, not in comfort, but to grip her arm, his fingers biting into her bruised flesh. See? Useless. Another day, another meal wasted. Around them, the town of Redemption Gulch watched, a chorus of silent judgment. They saw not a young woman fragile as a winter-starved bird, but a burden, a walking ailment. Rumors, like tumbleweeds, had skittered through the settlement since Silas dragged her in tow months ago, that she was consumptive, that she carried a blight, that her very presence soured the milk and spooked the livestock. Her thin dress, patched and repatched, did little to ward off the chill wind that always seemed to find the cracks in Redemption Gulch's veneer of civilization, just as it found the cracks in Elara's frail defenses. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were downcast, fixed on the scuffed toes of her worn-out boots, the only patch of ground that didn't seem to openly accuse her. Each harsh word from Silas, each pointed stare from a townsperson, was another lash against a spirit already flayed raw. She didn't cry. Tears were a luxury she had learned long ago she couldn't afford, they only ever seemed to incite greater wrath or a more insidious, cloying pity that felt worse than the blows. So she stood, a silent effigy of suffering, while the ledger, Silas's symbol of her unending debt, her worthlessness, remained open, a public declaration of her failure to be anything other than what they had named her, broken, sick, a liability. The raw-boned dog that scavenged near the saloon's back door looked healthier, more valued. And in the oppressive silence that followed Silas's pronouncement, broken only by Elara's hacking cough, the weight of the entire town seemed to press down on her, threatening to extinguish the last, flickering ember of her will to endure. This was her stage, and humiliation, her unending performance. Ethan Stone watched from the shadows of the assayer's office, his face, etched with lines of its own harsh history, betraying nothing. His presence in Redemption Gulch was rare. He preferred the stark solitude of his ranch nestled deep in the canyons, a place where the only judgments came from the wind and the changing seasons. He was a man of considerable means, the townsfolk whispered, though none knew the true extent of it, for he lived as simply as any hired hand. They knew his silence, the slight limp that favored his left leg, a relic of a war best forgotten, and the scar that silvered one temple, disappearing into his dark hair. He was an observer by nature, a man who had seen too much of the world's casual cruelty to be easily surprised, yet the scene unfolding before Silas Blackwood's emporium of misery stirred something cold and hard within him. He saw past the grime and the sickness, saw the tremor in Elara's thin shoulders that wasn't just from the cold or the cough, but from a deeper, more profound fear. He saw the defiance in the set of her jaw, almost imperceptible, a refusal to completely crumble despite the public dismantling of her dignity. For a long moment, Ethan wrestled with the ingrained desire to remain apart, to not invite the world's troubles to his door. His own wounds, though faded, still ached with the memory of loss, of vulnerability. But then Silas raised his hand again, not to strike, but to contemptuously push Elara further into the muck as if she were refuse, and something within Ethan snapped. He moved then, his quiet emergence from the alleyway as startling to the onlookers as a gunshot would have been. His steps were measured, the limp barely noticeable, but each one carried an undeniable weight, a quiet authority that hushed the snickers and drew every eye. He stopped before Silas, his shadow falling over the smaller, blustering man. Ethan didn't speak, merely looked, his gaze steady and unyielding. Silas, initially puffed with indignation at the interruption, seemed to shrink under that silent scrutiny. "What do you want, Stone?" he blustered, his voice losing some of its earlier bravado. Ethan's eyes flicked to Alara, then back to Silas. His voice, when it finally came, was low, rough as unplaned timber. "How much for the girl?" A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Silas blinked, momentarily nonplussed, then a sly, greedy light entered his eyes. "She's a sick one, Stone. Damaged goods. But she owes me plenty." He named a figure, an exorbitant sum meant to deter, or perhaps to simply exploit what he perceived as a rich man's sudden, inexplicable whim. Without a word, Ethan reached into his saddlebag, which he still wore slung across his shoulder, and drew out a leather pouch. He counted out the coins, the clink of gold against gold silencing every other sound in the street. He placed the sum in Silas's outstretched, grasping hand. "She's not your concern anymore," Ethan stated, his voice devoid of emotion, yet carrying the finality of a judge's gavel. He turned to Alara, who stared at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. He offered no smile, no gentle word. He simply nodded once, a curt gesture toward his horse tethered nearby. "Come," and the crowd, the cruel, judging chorus of Redemption Gulch, parted before them as if cleaved by an invisible blade, their whispers following like the rustle of dry leaves in the wake of a storm. The journey to Ethan Stone's ranch was a silent pilgrimage into an unknown future, each mile stretching Alara's anxiety tauter. She rode the placid mare he'd provided, her own worn saddlebags, containing all her worldly possessions, a spare, threadbare dress, a comb missing half its teeth, and a small, smooth stone she'd carried since childhood, tied behind the cantle. Ethan rode ahead, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent landscape, his broad back a wall she couldn't read, his silence an unnerving canvas onto which she painted her worst fears. Would this be a new cage, merely with a different keeper? The sun beat down, and the dust of the trail soon coated her as thoroughly as the dust of Redemption Gulch had. When they finally crested a rise, Solitude Ranch spread out below them, not grand, but starkly beautiful in its isolation. A simple, sturdy ranch house, built of local stone and timber, stood weathered and strong, smoke curling from its chimney like a welcoming breath. A few outbuildings, a barn, a corral, a small smithy, were scattered nearby, all kept in good repair. It was a place of order, of quiet industry, yet it felt as remote and silent as its name suggested. Ethan dismounted by a small, detached cabin, little more than a single room, but clean and with a tightly thatched roof. "This will be yours," he said, his voice still that low rumble, offering no explanation, no expectation. He gestured to a pail of fresh water by the door and a stack of firewood. Then, he simply turned and walked towards the main house, leaving her standing there, a mote of dust in the vastness of his domain. Fear was a familiar companion, but this new iteration was laced with a bewildering uncertainty. There were no immediate demands, no harsh words, no blows. Inside, the cabin was sparse but spotless. A narrow cot with a thick wool blanket, a small table and chair, a stone fireplace, swept clean. It was more than she'd had to call her own in years, yet the very emptiness of it, the lack of overt threat, was disorienting. For days, she moved like a ghost, starting at every sound, expecting the inevitable summons, the demand, the punishment. She scrubbed the cabin floor until the wood gleamed, though it was already clean. She mended her own pitiful garments, her fingers clumsy from disuse and fear. She watched Ethan from her small window as he went about his chores, tending his few cattle, mending fences, working the forge. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his presence a constant, silent weight on the landscape. He left food for her on the cabin stoop each morning and evening, fresh bread, a portion of stew, sometimes a piece of fruit. He never knocked, never spoke, just left the offerings and retreated. The first time she found a small, roughly folded piece of calico beside her meal pail, a bright, cheerful blue, utterly out of place in her drab existence, she stared at it for a long time before daring to pick it up. It was soft, new. A gift? An obligation? She didn't know, but she clutched it to her chest, the unfamiliar sensation of something given freely, without expectation of payment in pain, bringing a strange ache to her throat. She tried to earn her keep, sweeping the porch of the main house when he was away, fetching water from the creek, tasks she assigned herself, driven by a lifetime of conditioning that whispered she was worthless unless she was toiling. He never acknowledged these efforts, nor did he stop her. The silence of Solitude Ranch was profound, broken only by the wind in the pines, the distant lowing of cattle, the rhythmic clang of Ethan's hammer on anvil. It was a silence that slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to seep into Ilara's terror, not erasing it, but diluting its sharpest edges. The rhythm of Solitude Ranch settled into a pattern of quiet observation and unspoken gestures. Ilara, still wary as a startled fawn, began to venture further from her cabin, her movements less furtive, her breathing a little easier in the clean, pine-scented air. She noticed the small details of Ethan's life, the way he gentled his horses with a low murmur and a patient hand, the careful precision with which he repaired a broken harness, the neat stacks of firewood he maintained even as winter was a distant thought. He was a man of immense capability, yet he moved through his world with a profound lack of fuss. One blustery afternoon, the wooden shutter on her cabin window, loosened by the wind, began to bang with an irritating rhythm against the stone wall. Ilara tried to secure it with a piece of twine, but her efforts were clumsy, her fingers weak. She expected him to ignore it, or perhaps to grumble about the noise. Instead, later that day, while she was down by the creek gathering fallen branches for her small fireplace, she saw him approach her cabin. He carried a few tools and a small piece of new leather. He didn't look towards her, didn't acknowledge her presence, just set about repairing the shutter with a few swift, efficient movements, replacing the frayed leather tie with the new, stronger piece. He tested it, ensuring it was secure and silent, then gathered his tools and walked away. No words were exchanged, yet the gesture resonated deeply within Ilara. It was an act of consideration, a small comfort offered without fanfare, without demand. It was another brick in the slowly building wall of tentative trust. One morning, she found a small, intricately carved wooden bird resting on the stoop beside her breakfast. It was no bigger than her thumb, its tiny wings detailed with delicate knife strokes, its form surprisingly lifelike. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the smooth, polished wood. It was beautiful, a small, perfect thing in a world that had offered her little but ugliness. She knew, without being told, that it was his work. She had seen him sometimes in the evenings, sitting on the porch of the main house, a piece of wood and a knife in his hands, his scarred face softened in the fading light as he whittled. She took the bird inside, placing it on the rough sill of her window where the morning sun caught it. It was a tiny beacon of something she couldn't yet name. She began to leave small offerings of her own in return, though she doubted he even noticed. A handful of wild berries she'd found growing near the creek, laid carefully on the edge of his porch. A patch neatly sewn onto one of his discarded work shirts she'd found by the wash basin. These were her silent words, her hesitant acknowledgments of his quiet kindnesses. The fear didn't vanish entirely, but it receded, like a tide going out, leaving behind a fragile shoreline of nascent hope. She still coughed sometimes, especially when the air was cold or dusty, but the rattling in her chest seemed less severe. The relentless ache in her limbs began to ease with the regular food and the absence of daily brutality. She was still thin, still marked by her past, but a sliver of light had found its way into the darkness. One evening, as a biting wind howled outside, presaging an early, unseasonable chill, Ilara found herself hesitating by the path that led from her cabin to the main house. Ethan had left her usual meal, but tonight, the portion seemed larger, the stew richer, and alongside it, a tin mug of something warm that smelled of herbs and honey. He was on his porch, staring into the flames of a small fire he'd built in an outdoor hearth, the light flickering across his stoic features. A silent invitation, perhaps, or merely her own desperate longing for a sliver of human connection. Taking a breath that was more courage than air, she walked towards him, clutching the mug. He glanced up as she approached, his expression unreadable in the dancing firelight, but he didn't send her away. He simply shifted slightly, making a small space on the rough-hewn bench beside him. She sat, her movements stiff, unsure. For a long time, they sat in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the mournful cry of the wind. Then, his voice, low and gravelly, broke the quiet. "The war," he said, not looking at her, his gaze fixed on the flames. "It teaches you things. About men. About loss he paused, and she sensed the weight of unspoken memories pressing down on him. Lost my company at Shiloh. Most of them, anyway. Good men. He picked up a stick and poked at the fire, sending a shower of sparks into the darkness. Came back. Tried to build something. Wife? Sarah. He choked on the name, a raw sound that tore at something in Ilara's chest. And our boy, little Tom. Fever took him. Both within a week. He finally turned to her, and in the firelight, she saw the sheen of unshed tears in his eyes, a vulnerability that mirrored her own. This place, solitude, it was all I had left. Or all I thought I wanted. Ilara felt her own carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. His pain was a raw, open wound, and in its presence, her own didn't seem so isolating. Hesitantly, her voice barely a whisper, she began to speak. My parents, they had too many mouths. Sold me to a tinker when I was 10. He wasn't kind. She traced the rim of her mug with a trembling finger. After him, there were others. Each one, they said I was sickly. Weak. That I ate more than I earned. Her cough, a familiar punctuation to her misery, escaped her then, dry and rasping. They called me cursed. Said I brought ill luck. She looked at Ethan, her eyes pleading for understanding, or perhaps just for him to not look away. I tried to be strong. Tried to work hard. But the beatings, they made the sickness worse. Or maybe the sickness invited the beatings. He listened, his silence no longer unnerving, but attentive, a quiet space for her to lay down her burdens. When she finished, a profound quiet settled between them again, but it was different now, infused with shared sorrow, with a fragile, burgeoning empathy. Sickness of the body is one thing, Ethan said softly, his gaze meeting hers. Sickness of the spirit, from a world that offers no kindness, that's a harder cure. He reached out then, his large, calloused hand briefly covering hers where it rested on the bench. A simple touch, yet it sent a shockwave of warmth through her, a human connection she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. The wind still howled, but inside the small circle of firelight, a tentative peace had begun to bloom. The fragile peace of solitude was shattered by the arrival of a blizzard, a white fury that swept down from the northern peaks with unexpected ferocity, weeks before the first snows were typically due. The sky turned a malevolent grey, and the wind screamed like a banshee, driving snow so thick it blotted out the landscape in minutes. Ethan had ridden out early, checking the high pasture fence lines, aiming to bring the small herd closer to the barn before the worst of it hit. Ilara watched him go, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach as the first flakes began to fall. Hours passed. The snow piled into deep drifts, obscuring landmarks, transforming the familiar contours of the ranch into an alien, hostile world. The wind howled relentlessly, rattling the shutters of her small cabin, now securely fastened thanks to Ethan's earlier care. Her worry for him grew with each passing moment, a cold dread that seeped into her bones, far deeper than the chill of the storm. He should have been back by now. Armed with a courage born of desperation, Ilara bundled herself in every layer she possessed, her own thin dress, the wool blanket from her cot, and an old, oversized coat of Ethan she'd found hanging in the lean-to. It scent faintly of him, of wood smoke and horses. She plunged into the storm, the wind tearing at her, the snow stinging her face, blinding her. She called his name, her voice snatched away by the gale, a pathetic little sound against the storm's monstrous roar. She followed the fence line as best she could, her progress agonizingly slow, her legs sinking deep into the rapidly accumulating snow. Then, she saw it, a dark shape against the white, partially buried. His horse, reins trailing, shivering and riderless, huddled near a copse of snow-laden pines. Panic clawed at her throat. A little further on, she found him. A large pine branch, heavy with snow, had cracked and fallen, pinning his leg. He was conscious, but his face was pale, his lips tinged with blue. He'd managed to free his leg, but it was clearly injured, and the cold had begun its insidious work. Ethan! He looked up, his eyes unfocused for a moment, then relief flickered. Ilara, foolish, to come out his words were slurred. She didn't waste time. Her own frailty, her persistent cough, were forgotten. Adrenaline surged through her, a primal instinct to protect this man who had shown her the first real kindness she had ever known. She helped him to his feet, his arm heavy across her shoulders, his injured leg dragging. The journey back to the ranch house was a brutal, agonizing ordeal. Each step was a battle against the wind, the snow, and Ethan's dead weight. She stumbled, fell, but always, she got back up, driven by a fierce, protective will. When they finally reached the main house, collapsing through the door, she was near exhaustion, but her task was far from over. She managed to drag him to his bed, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. A raging fever soon took hold, a consequence of the cold and perhaps an infection setting into his leg, or an old wound from the war stirring anew. He became delirious, muttering about battles and lost names. For 3 days and nights, Ilara was his sole guardian. She packed his injured leg with snow to keep the swelling down, then later, when the fever burned hottest, with cool cloths soaked in icy water from melted snow. She remembered snippets of herbal lore her grandmother had once tried to teach her, a knowledge she'd thought long buried. She brewed a potent tea from pine needles, rich in spirits of turpentine, something her grandmother swore by for chest ailments and fevers. She forced sips of it between his cracked lips. She kept the fire roaring, rationing their wood carefully. She melted snow for water. She spoke to him softly, soothingly, when his delirium was at its worst, her voice a low hum that seemed to calm his restless thrashing. She forgot to eat, forgot to sleep, her entire being focused on his survival. In his brief moments of lucidity, Ethan would look at her, his eyes filled with a dazed gratitude. He saw not the sick girl from Redemption Gulch, but a woman of incredible tenacity, her slight frame housing a spirit of pure steel. The cough still troubled her, especially in the smoky cabin, but it was a distant concern. Her focus was absolute. Slowly, painstakingly, the fever began to recede. The light of reason returned to his eyes. He was weak, his leg throbbing, but he was alive. And Ilara, who had been deemed too sick to work, had saved him. The blizzard eventually blew itself out, leaving Solitude Ranch entombed in a silent, glittering world of white. Ethan's recovery was slow, his leg badly sprained and bruised, confinement chafing his independent spirit. Ilara continued to care for him, her earlier desperation replaced by a quiet, steady competence. She cooked simple, nourishing meals, kept the fire stoked, and changed the dressings on his leg with a gentle touch that belied the roughness of her past. A new dynamic had settled between them, forged in the crucible of the storm. The silences were no longer fraught with uncertainty but filled with a comfortable, shared understanding. One afternoon, as Ethan sat propped up in bed, his gaze following Ilara as she moved about the small cabin, he finally spoke of what weighed on him. "Silas Blackwood," he said, his voice still weak but clear. "He won't have forgotten the money." Or use. Ilara paused in her task of stirring the soup simmering over the hearth, her back to him. She had pushed thoughts of Silas and Redemption Gulch to the furthest recesses of her mind, but Ethan's words brought them rushing back, a cold tide of remembered fear. "He knows I paid your supposed debt," Ethan continued, "but men like Silas, their greed has no bottom. He might think there's more to be had. Or he might simply want back what he considers his property." Out of spite, Ilara turned, her face pale. "What can we do?" she whispered, the old terror resurfacing. "I can't go back there." "You won't," Ethan said, his voice firm, his eyes meeting hers with a protective intensity that warmed her despite her fear. "This is your home now, Ilara, if you want it." His words, simple and direct, were a lifeline. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Weeks later, as the snows began to melt and the first signs of a reluctant spring appeared, their fragile peace was indeed threatened. A lone rider approached the ranch. It wasn't Silas Blackwood, but someone far more dangerous, Jedediah Pike, a notorious bounty hunter whose reputation for ruthlessness preceded him across 3 territories. Pike was a gaunt, leather-tough man with eyes like chips of ice. He dismounted, his hand never straying far from the Colt Peacemaker strapped to his hip. "Ethan Stone," he drawled, his gaze sweeping over the ranch, lingering on Ilara, who stood frozen on the porch. "Heard you were harboring a runaway girl by the name of Ilara. Belonged to a fella back east." Seems she skipped out on a hefty contract. Ethan, now able to move with the aid of a sturdy cane, stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Ilara. His face was grim. The war had left him with a deep aversion to violence, a reluctance to ever again take up arms unless absolutely necessary. He had sought peace in solitude, but peace, it seemed, was a fickle mistress. "There's no runaway here, Pike," Ethan said, his voice even. "The woman you're referring to was bought and paid for. Her debts are settled." Pike chuckled, a dry, mirthless sound. "That ain't how my employer sees it. He paid good money for her. Says she's his. Got papers to prove it." He patted a breast pocket. "Now, you can hand her over nice and easy, Stone, and I'll be on my way. Or we can do this the hard way. Makes no difference to me. I always get what I come for." The air crackled with tension. Ethan looked at Ilara, saw the stark terror in her eyes, and knew he couldn't let Pike take her. This wasn't just about a debt or a contract, it was about protecting the flicker of hope he'd seen rekindle in her, the life they were slowly, tentatively building together. His reluctance to fight, born of old traumas, warred with a fierce, primal need to defend her, to defend their sanctuary. The sun beat down on the small yard, glinting off the metal of Pike's peacemaker as his hand hovered near its butt. Ethan Stone stood his ground, his cane planted firmly, his body a shield before Ilara. "She's not going anywhere with you, Pike," Ethan stated, his voice low but carrying an unshakable resolve. The ghosts of Shiloh whispered in his ears, the clang of steel, the screams of men, but a stronger imperative now drove him, the fierce, protective instinct that Ilara had awakened. Pike's lips curled into a sneer. "Brave words, cripple. You and what army?" He took a step forward, his eyes, cold and predatory, fixed on Ilara. "Come on, girl. Don't make this uglier than it needs to be." Ilara, though trembling, didn't cower. She met Pike's gaze, a spark of defiance igniting in her storm-gray eyes. She had been bought and sold, beaten and demeaned, but something had shifted within her during the long days at Solitude, something nurtured by Ethan's quiet strength and her own discovered resilience. She was no longer just a victim. As Pike reached out a hand to grab her arm, Ethan moved with surprising speed for a man with an injured leg. He brought his heavy cane up in a swift arc, knocking Pike's arm aside. The bounty hunter snarled, his hand flashing towards his gun, but Ethan was already following through, a lifetime of hard ranch work and the brutal necessities of war guiding his movements. He didn't have a gun drawn, his fight was more elemental, a desperate defense. The confrontation was short, brutal, and anything but heroic. It was a clumsy, desperate struggle in the dust. Pike, overconfident and perhaps disdainful of a man he considered past his prime, found Ethan a more formidable opponent than expected. Ethan fought not with skill, but with the raw power of a man defending his last hope. He took a glancing blow to the head that sent stars exploding behind his eyes, but he grappled with Pike, forcing him back, away from Ilara. It was Ilara who created the opening. Seeing Pike momentarily off balance as he wrestled with Ethan, she snatched up a heavy iron skillet left near the outdoor hearth. With a cry that was part fear, part fury, she swung it with all her might, connecting soundly with the side of Pike's head. The bounty hunter grunted, his eyes glazing over, and he stumbled, giving Ethan the chance he needed. Ethan drove his shoulder into Pike's chest, sending him sprawling into the dirt. Before Pike could recover or reach for his dropped gun, Ethan was on him, his hands surprisingly strong, pinning him. The fight was over. Pike, dazed and defeated, lay panting in the dust, his arrogance extinguished. Ethan, breathing heavily, his old leg wound screaming in protest, his head throbbing, looked at Ilara. Her face was pale, but her eyes blazed. She still clutched the skillet, a makeshift weapon in her trembling hands. Later, after Pike had been disarmed, his horse taken, and sent walking back towards Redemption Gulch with a stern warning to never return, Ethan and Ilara stood by the creek as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The adrenaline had faded, leaving them both exhausted but bound by a new, unspoken understanding. Ethan turned to her, his face bruised, his clothes torn. He reached into his pocket and pulled out not a weapon, but a small, worn wooden locket, intricately carved with the image of a wildflower breaking through stone, a piece he had been working on for weeks. It was attached to a simple leather thong. He pressed it into her hand. This ranch. Solitude, it was just a name. A place to hide from the world. He looked into her eyes, his own filled with an emotion she had never seen there before, a deep, abiding tenderness. But you, Ilara, you showed me it could be a home. It needs a heart. And you, he hesitated, searching for the right words. You are not for keeping. You are not a possession, or a debt, or a burden. You are for choosing. And I choose you, Ilara. If you'll choose this life, with me, tears, hot and unexpected, welled in Ilara's eyes, but this time, they were not tears of sorrow or fear, but of an overwhelming, cathartic release. She could only nod, her fingers closing tightly around the precious locket, the wood warm against her palm. A year later, the first wildflowers of spring painted the meadows around the ranch in vibrant strokes of purple, yellow, and blue. The sign at the entrance no longer read Solitude Ranch in freshly painted letters, it now declared Heartwood Ranch, a name Ilara had chosen, a name that spoke of the strength and resilience they had found in each other, at the very core of their shared life. Ilara herself was transformed. The gaunt, haunted look was gone, replaced by a quiet radiance. Her cough was a distant memory, her frame filled out, her movements imbued with a gentle confidence. The sun had kissed her skin, and her storm-grey eyes now held the calm clarity of a summer sky after rain. She moved through her days with purpose, her hands, once raw and trembling, now skilled in tending her flourishing garden, in baking bread that filled the small house with its comforting aroma, in mixing herbal remedies that brought relief to the few neighboring families who had slowly, cautiously, begun to seek her out. Ethan watched her, his heart full. The lines of pain and sorrow on his face had softened, replaced by a quiet contentment. His limp was still there, a permanent reminder of the past, but it no longer defined him. He had found a peace deeper than mere solitude, he had found connection, purpose, love. He worked the land with renewed vigor, the ranch thriving under their combined care. They spoke more now, their conversations easy and unhurried, filled with the small details of their days, with shared laughter, and with plans for the future. The little carved bird still sat on the windowsill of their now shared cabin, a testament to the first fragile seeds of trust. The wooden locket, with its image of a wildflower breaking through stone, rested always against Ilara's heart, a symbol of her own blossoming. The community of Redemption Gulch, once so quick to judge and condemn, had slowly begun to change its tune. Whispers still followed Ilara, but they were different now. They spoke of Ilara of Heartwood, the woman with the healing touch, the one who had calmed old man Hemlock's raging stallion when no one else dared approach, the one whose poultices had drawn the infection from young Timmy Carver's badly gashed leg. They spoke of the way flowers seemed to bloom brighter under her care, of the quiet wisdom in her eyes. When she and Ethan rode into town for supplies, the averted gazes and scornful looks were replaced by nods of respect, sometimes even hesitant smiles. Silas Blackwood still scowled from the doorway of his store, but his power over her, over the town's perception of her, was broken. He was a relic of a past they had all, in some way, begun to move beyond. Children, once warned away from the sick girl, now sometimes approached her shyly, offering a freshly picked wildflower or a smooth river stone, their innocent acceptance a balm to old wounds. The transformation of Heartwood Ranch mirrored the transformation within Ethan and Ilara. The once dark and lonely cabin now had curtains of cheerful calico at the windows, sewn by Ilara's own hand. Pots of herbs and flowers lined the porch railing, their fragrance mingling with the scent of wood smoke and baking bread. The small outbuilding that had been her solitary refuge was now a workshop where she dried herbs and prepared her remedies, its door always open, a symbol of her integration into the heart of their shared life. Ethan had rebuilt the section of fence damaged in the blizzard, making it stronger than before, just as their bond had been forged stronger through adversity. He often found himself pausing in his work simply to watch Ilara as she moved about the garden, her dark hair loosened by the breeze, a faint song sometimes on her lips. She was no longer the broken creature he had rescued from the dust of Redemption Gulch, she was a woman who had found her strength, her voice, her place. And in finding herself, she had helped him find the parts of himself he thought long dead and buried. Their love was not a fiery, tempestuous passion, but a deep, steady current, like the river that wound its way through the valley below Heartwood. It was built on shared hardship, mutual respect, and 1,000 unspoken kindnesses. It was a love that had taken root in barren ground and, against all odds, blossomed. The people of Redemption Gulch, witnessing this quiet miracle, began to understand that strength was not always loud and boisterous, that healing could come in unexpected forms, and that true value lay not in what a person possessed, but in the content of their character and the kindness they showed to others. Elara, the outcast, the one they had labeled too sick to work, had become a quiet inspiration, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. She never preached, never boasted of her skills, but her very presence, her gentle competence, and the undeniable good she brought to those around her, chipped away at the town's harsh prejudices. Heartwood Ranch became a place of quiet pilgrimage for some, a place to seek not just Elara's remedies for the body, but also a measure of the peace that seemed to emanate from its core. They had built more than a ranch, they had built a sanctuary, a testament to the enduring power of compassion to heal even the deepest wounds, a place where two broken souls had found not just solace, but a love that remade their world. The story of the wealthy, stoic cowboy and the sick girl he adopted had, in its own quiet way, begun to redeem not just them, but a small corner of a harsh and unforgiving frontier. And as the seasons turned, their life together unfolded with the simple, profound beauty of a wildflower pushing its way through stone, a testament to hope, to choosing, and to the enduring strength found in a heartwood tended with love. They had discovered that home wasn't merely a place, but the safe harbor found in another's understanding, a truth that resonated far beyond the fences of their small, thriving ranch. Her journey from a beaten outcast to a cherished partner shows us that true worth is never defined by circumstance, but by the unyielding spirit within. Ethan didn't just offer her shelter, he offered her belief. And in that belief, she found the strength not only to heal herself but to heal him in return, proving that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in hearts the world has discarded. Their story reminds us that kindness can be the most powerful medicine, and that everyone, no matter how broken they may seem, deserves a chance to bloom. If their journey from despair to devotion touched your heart, please show your support. Like this video, share their story of resilience and redemption, and subscribe to our channel for more tales that inspire hope and celebrate the enduring power of the human spirit.